Okay, so the restaurant industry continues to be on the front page news of just about every newspaper, website, social media account across the industry, and today is no different as Florida and Governor Ron DeSantis make some pretty amazing statements that could affect the restaurant industry in both good and bad ways. With me today, I've got Larry Carrino of Brustman Carrino right here out of Miami. My name is Paul Barron, and this is the Barron Report. Larry, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks. Good to be here. Thank you, Paul. Good to see you. And like you said, I wish it was under better circumstances, but it is
Yeah,
good to see your face again.
absolutely. For our viewers and listeners, Larry is a friend of the network, and he represents a ton of great restaurants and chefs around the country, and just does an exemplary job of really spreading the good word of the industry in most times. Of course, now you're up against a little different storytelling process, Larry. Tell me a little bit about Brustman Carrino, what you guys are currently doing.
Well, the agency is 35 plus years old. My mentor, the founder, Susan Brustman, started it back in the 80s and was instrumental. She was the voice behind the South Beach Renaissance when South Beach first became South Beach,
Yep.
and helped basically tell that story internationally when it was the epicenter of all that was hot and cool and hip. And I joined the firm 25 years ago, grew up in the restaurant industry while I was growing up in the PR industry, and fell in love with the job. But I fell in love with the job because I fell in love with restaurants. If we'd
Yeah.
been a PR firm that specialized in something other than that, I know I would have probably switched vocations quickly. But we, in that time, have become the go-to agency for culinary and hospitality PR, and now I went from being the coffee boy and the receptionist to president of the company. So it's been
There you
an
go.
amazing 25 years, and certainly we're going through a very interesting time right now, and that's being kind.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very much so. Of course, and when you look at South Florida, for all of our listeners, Florida has been kind of a microcosm of what's happening almost globally, but even more so, we're under a very, I wouldn't say a bit of scrutiny, but Florida is always looked at, much like California and maybe even Texas to a certain extent, as pretty much the domino that falls. Of how it goes in Florida, it goes in many cases the rest of the country. And with our actions, meaning our government actions around what's happening, and it's weird that we talk so much about government's issues when we're talking about the food industry business. But Larry, with what Governor DeSantis talked about today of potentially going back to 100% occupancy here in the state of Florida for restaurants, do you feel that all of the cities are going to comply and just say, hey, let's just go for it and open our doors back up completely with maybe very little of a mask mandate here in the state of Florida? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, full disclosure, I've read, the initial reports about what Governor DeSantis had to say, and I know there was some language in there that was curious,
Yeah,
including the line about that it bars counties and cities from limiting or restricting businesses unless there could be proof given that there's some health or financial reason to
yeah,
do so. So, as we've seen since this whole thing played out, Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, in different
right.
capacities, were the exception to the rule. There was the whole state of Florida, and then there
Yep.
was us.
South Florida.
And that
Yep.
always tends to be the way things are, even with elections, where you see a lot of red and then you have your blue, et cetera. You know, I don't know. What I have read on social media thus far was that there were some conversations going on about what does this mean for particularly Miami-Dade County, where right
Hmm.
now the majority of my clients are. I have clients in Dade and Broward, as well as in New Orleans, where we have a division. I'm curious to see how this is going to play out for South
Yeah.
Florida for us. I'm happy about the rule strictly from a standpoint of I know what my clients are going through and I want them to survive and I want them to thrive. But more than that, I'm terrified for the implications of the jump from 50 to 100%, and what does that potentially mean in terms of what is the ripple effect from that. But we shall see.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
my next thing is to find out, well, where does that leave South Florida? Are we again the exception to the rule, or does the language that I have read stand, meaning statewide, counties and
Yep.
cities, it doesn't matter where, you have to make a case for why you're going to restrict like we have been if they are
Right.
going to.
Yeah. This will be interesting to watch. We've been doing a ton of research along the way across the major states that were hit the most, being California, Texas, Florida, New York, and both from a consumer standpoint, but also from an operator standpoint. One thing that came back on a recent research piece that we did in the state of New York, specifically because of New York being in the pretense of returning to 25% occupancy, the question we had was, would consumers go back to restaurants? What percentages would go back by the end of the year? And then how many of you would maybe refrain from going back to a restaurant till maybe next year? It was very surprising that only about 20% of people that responded, we had over 3,000 people on the response research, said that they would go back now, which means 80% of the market was still very cautious and reserved. Now that is still in New York, a little bit different here in South Florida, but it'll be interesting to see how this might play out here in South Florida. When you look at South Florida and the bars and restaurants that you work with, do you feel like chefs and operators across the South Florida market will look at this as, hey, even though it is 100%, I might actually just kind of, operate a little differently here to try to keep my customers more safe and my staff safe? Or do you feel like we may just get a pedal to the metal response on this from the industry?
My feeling is we're going to have a mix of both. This is gut, but it is gut based on knowing my clients the way that
Yep.
I do and how much we communicate. And even the minute the news broke about the governor's edict,
Yep.
my phone started going ballistic. I started
Sure.
texting my clients, and then of course they started texting me. And I think that we're going to have a mix. I think that you are
Yeah.
going to see operators in the same way that we saw operators adhering to, whether regardless of your political bet, the same way we saw operators, restaurateurs, chefs, owners adhering to, whether it was common sense rules, whether it was out of an abundance of caution, whether it was the city or county mandates. You simultaneously saw operators act like it was November 2019 and we were
Yeah.
all just, gearing up for the holidays and come one, come all. I think we're going to see that here. I can
Interesting.
definitely tell you that a number of my clients have already said to me, well, we're easing in the same way that I had some when they got the word that they could reopen, they said, not so fast. I'm going to ease into this. But I
Yeah.
think others are going to be like, let's get these tables back in. Let's get butts in seats. Let's start making back some of the money we lost. And that is what concerns me, is that it's that 50 to 100 jump. And what does that mean in terms of how many people are coming through doors, how many people are on top of one another? So I think there's going to be a number of places that are going to be cautious about it, but I think you're going to see just as many, potentially, if not more, saying, well, they said we can, so we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
And let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, and I think the concern I have, because we've already seen the start-stop occur here in Miami-Dade, where we got the opening signal and then bam, we got slapped again and closures began. So my concern in watching the markets kind of fall where they may, Florida's making the first 100% move that I know of that's in a major epic center of where the coronavirus was really living. And being able to go back to 100%, it'll be interesting to see how this kind of, because if we do start to see a number of case rises due to this, especially like what we've seen with areas around university towns where those cases have started to move up, the question will be whether or not the operators kind of ease back. Because if we get too aggressive, we could end up with another forced closure, which would be devastating to see that kind of thing occur. Yeah, so because the start and stop, listen, for a lot of our operators, you guys already know this, it takes a lot to spin up a restaurant back to 100% capacity.
Yeah.
Training for all the people you lost, restocking, retraining. Now you've got retraining under all these new conditions and rules. This is going to be a very interesting time. Larry, when you're talking with these operators, messaging is going to be a very key thing for them from a PR standpoint. Because if they message the wrong way and something goes left, they could kind of be in a bad spot from a PR standpoint because they were maybe a restaurant that chose the direction of let's go 100% capacity. And if something bad does happen, could they see kind of a recoil from the market, including their own customers, if they don't message this out correctly?
I mean, I think that any of us, even from beyond a messaging standpoint, I think from an operations standpoint, and I experienced this when we were able to reopen, I guess, our second time.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And where beyond messaging, where customers were having really visceral reactions to what they experienced at the restaurant. So that idea of when you go into a place and word travels very, very fast. But I'm talking, and I'll say this is clear, specifically from an industry standpoint where, we're in a little bit of a bubble in that we all talk to one another. And word get around of where it felt safe and where it didn't feel safe. And I think that businesses, possibly to their detriment, even if they are not putting people at risk, and we don't need to get into a conversation about if they are or they aren't, that's not the topic here, but the idea of perception as it relates to your question. So the idea that even if because if theoretically you could do 100% and have people feel safe, as opposed to a place which is what we experienced before, where it was at 50%, and I had coworkers going to restaurants and saying, I will not go back there. Those people clearly do not care, where it felt unsafe. So I think that the messaging is important, but I also feel almost more than that is taking the media out of it is how are customers, patrons feeling when they're on the premises? Because, and I say this to all of my clients, I can do a gangbuster's job from a media messaging, PR, and marketing standpoint. It is incredibly difficult for me to counter really aggressive, negative word of mouth. So I can say 16 things about everything that you're doing to make your customers feel safe and how you're taking incremental steps and blah, blah, blah. But the minute someone walks in the door and goes, this place feels like COVID central, I'm out. That is the message that they're going to spread to their friends and family. And that is also what they'll probably put on social media, whether they're on Yelp or they're just on Instagram. So I think the messaging is very important, but I think the reality is even more important than the messaging. And I'm a PR guy saying that.
Well, I think you're going right down the right track. I think you're definitely dead on with that because you're correct. If you look at and it's even a more heightened sense of awareness by these consumers. Obviously, they know what's going on just as much as everybody else does. And I'm watching, kind of the habits of consumers a lot when I go out. And whether we're dining out or we're going to restaurants who have clearly abided, we have a few restaurants that we hang in. And you're right, the ones that we go to are the ones we trust, the ones that we know the operator is actually taking very significant steps to keep everybody safe. And I think you're going to see this continue to climb. It may actually create kind of a differentiation of operators who are doing it right versus operators who are doing it wrong. And we could see a splitting of the pack, especially in South Beach, which is one of the most densely populated restaurant scenes in America. When you look at that, and let's kind of take the angle here of two restaurants. One operator goes the cautious route, basically at the risk of losing revenue, but he or she is maintaining a structure on going this direction. How long do you think those companies can stay on course before financially it just doesn't work for them? Versus a guy over here who may go the other route 100%, but he may only be good for the next 3 or 4 months because word of mouth becomes a problem. If you had those two kind of cases, What are you conferencing with your clients about in those two scenarios?
Well, if a client asked me which way should we go, understanding, a point you made earlier, which is correct, where I made the comment of you're going to have people who are going to be cautious, and then you're going to have people who are like, let's go, let's go, let's go. You made a
Right.
very valid point that I want to highlight is, of course, let's go, let's go, let's go is predicated on the training of the staff to getting the tables back.
Sure.
You can't just go from 50 to 100% within a day's meal. You got to, it
Yep.
takes time. But
Yep.
once you get to a place where those restaurants are operating 100%. A client coming to me, I would suggest caution and incremental increase that is, which is on par with their staffing, their training, et cetera, et cetera. I think that it's hard to see where this is going to go, but I do think that those that go slow and steady are going to do better, I think, because there are going to be the clientele ultimately will embrace that, and I think the feeling of safety will win the day.
Yeah.
Well, but simultaneously, and I'm not trying to talk out of both sides of my mouth here, but simultaneously, I feel like there are any number of restaurants that would be packed tomorrow with people who just want to go out and have a good time, and maybe haven't necessarily been as worried or as cautious, or et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, we're all in this together, Paul. And what
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
I think is the greatest danger, and when we reopened a second time, I had clients say to me and these are clients that even thought possibly when the first closures happened that they weren't going to see the light of day, that it was
Hmm.
probably going to be over. When they reopened a second time and we all, said, okay, where are we going to go from here? They said to me, if we get closed again, it's over. I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm out.
Yeah.
And so whether this guy's at 50, this guy's at 70, this young lady is at 100, whatever the case may be, however anyone comports themselves, ultimately, if we get to a place where this goes south in a very,
Yeah.
very big way, and we look at a industry-wide closure, because unless I'm mistaken, Governor DeSantis's mandate also included bars,
Yeah.
right? So if you want to talk about areas of transmission, 100% capacity at a bar, or if nightclubs are opening, regardless, if we get to a place where the numbers are so bad that we have to start not even going back 75, 50%, if we go back to delivery or takeout only
Hmm.
and dining
Yeah.
rooms are shut, catastrophic, I don't think would be the word.
Yeah.
I'm lucky that I made it. And I'm in the industry in an ancillary capacity. I'm a service
Yeah.
provider for people who cook and bed and are sites of hospitality and food and beverage. I provide a service to them. Without them, there is no me. I made it through with them because we are truly all in this together. If we get to a place where there is a industry-wide closure,
Hmm.
it's going to be absolutely horrendous, and it already
Yeah.
is horrendous.
Yeah, and I think you're dead on there with that point, Larry. I just don't know that the industry, especially here in South Florida, where you've got so much tourism, and listen, we're going to see people flocking to this state now because of the fact that hey, the open sign is back up here in Florida. From a tourism standpoint, we will get a large portion of people who could most likely care less about that and not looking at the long-term effect that our businesses have here in South Florida. I hope you are correct that we see operators who take it very slowly and cautiously. I think you're right. I think they will be rewarded. It could eventually become a angle of an advantage for
Mhm.
operators who are doing it through a step process. It'll be interesting to talk with a few of them. We've got a few coming on the show next week to see how they are going to respond to this, and if they're going to go full bore or if they're going to take some very cautious steps and go in that direction. One
I mean,
last question for you.
the one thing I would
Go
say
ahead.
is that just because someone says, don't worry, you can eat the whole jar of jelly beans, it doesn't mean you should.
Yeah,
Okay. I
right.
mean, it doesn't mean you should. And just because, and, I'm not trying to be contrarian, but just because the rule is you can, it begs the question, should, and not even should
Yeah.
you from a collective standpoint, I think operators need to ask themselves that. Should I? Should
Yeah,
I
right.
should I reopen my bar tomorrow and pack this place, or should I say, listen, and messaging comes into play here. Should I
Yeah.
maybe say, okay, we're going to reopen, but we're going to keep it at 50%, and we're gonna do this. We'll have the hand sanitizer. Maybe we'll have our own mask mandate because there's not a
Hmm.
statewide mandate, there's not a nationwide mandate. So I think that people need to ask themselves those questions in a series of questions, even though there may be a flag of go forth and
Yeah.
prosper.
Yeah, well, we just as of today, once we saw the release from DeSantis, the plan is to go out, do a quick targeted survey of consumers here in South Florida, basically get their feedback on whether or not they like or dislike the idea. Would they go to a restaurant that is 100% versus someone who's taking step cautions to keep them safe? I mean, I think that's an obvious answer, but I want to hear it from the consumers here in South Florida to really understand that. Okay, so let's move off of the doom and gloom and hopefully get back to restaurant business as usual, or at least within certain parameters of something that's a little bit more a semblance to normal business. How far do you think that is, Larry? Do you think that's a year out yet? What are your thoughts on that?
I think certainly my guess would be maybe Q2 of next year
Q2, yeah,
in terms of, and again, what I have said to so many people since all of this happened is the one thing that has been paralyzing occasionally, but
right,
so very frustrating was the unpredictability of everything.
yeah,
And so, we're at a place now. Okay, so now we're at 100%. What does that mean? So it's sort of like, I'm dating myself. But when I was a kid, there used to be these things called choose your own adventure books, where it was like, if you're going to go in the attic, turn to page 68. If you're not going to go in the attic, turn to page 42. We're at a place where it could go this way, it could go that way, it could zig, it could zag. If things, regardless of this 100% opening, if
yeah,
things continue, whether it's ebbs and peaks and valleys with
hmm,
infection, and we don't end up seeing a closure, I think we're still looking at months and months of recovery.
right,
We've got to get through the holidays and then into, and we're talking about specifically South Florida. I think we are
yeah,
going to see, knock on wood, an increase in travel in the new year with people wanting to get away from winter.
yeah.
But in terms of things being to the way they are or something close to normal, I when this all went down, it felt like to me, okay, I guess we're on this roller coaster until March of next year, easily.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you're right. I think we are going to see a prolonged effect here on the industry if we can maintain a little bit of continuity, at least in terms of the slowing down the closures, which is the biggest concern we've seen. New York is just decimated with closures. California, same kind of scenario. Texas had a very large number. Florida we had our share. But we kind of fared a little bit lighter than some of the country, even though we did have a highly, abnormally high closure rate and non-recovery. It'll be interesting to see how that goes all the way into next year, and for those restaurant operators who can kind of keep it going. If you were giving a tip for an operator in being able to message through these times, between now and say first quarter next year, what would be your kind of, I know it's not as easy as, hey, just do this and it's all going to get fixed, but
Right.
one thing that they should be looking out for?
Well, I think that first and foremost, I think that trying it's so impossible now to go with the direction of the wind in terms of, well, what does the general populace think, and you should go do
Right.
that. Number one, that's never my advice to begin with,
Hmm.
because it presumes that or assumes that the general populace is right, and that's the direction that's best for you, is from a business standpoint. I'm not talking about morality or philosophy.
Right. Right.
And now, particularly with there being such stark divides, it's even more difficult, where it's almost now not even going with the general populace, it's pick a side, which
Yep.
can be even more difficult or more detrimental as a business person.
Hmm.
I think
Yep.
first and foremost is that you have to look at your own operational feasibility, and in terms of a messaging standpoint, I think, and I always say this to clients, operations leads PR. In the same way I said earlier, I could say any number of things, and then someone walks in the restaurant or bar and says, I'm completely uncomfortable, I'm out, and I'm going to tell everyone I know not to come back here. Operationally, what is it that you can do safely and responsibly for yourself, for your livelihood, for your employees, the people who rely on you, and your patrons? And do that and make the messaging match that. You know, I had a conference call with a client earlier, and they're thinking about a program they want to launch, and we were talking through the negatives and the positives. Well, what could the media say about this, and what could the media say about that? And ultimately, what I said to them was, well, your response fundamentally at the end of the day is, I understand where you're coming from. I'm trying to do what is most responsible for my company, while at the same time being as conscientious as I can be about the health of my employees and my customers. And I said, that is a pretty solid response to why did you decide to go the way that you're going? And so that is what and everyone's answer is going to be different, and that's okay. But I think that at the end of the day, you do have to look at yourself in the mirror and go, not just did I act responsibly, but did I do what was right for long-term survival and success, as opposed to like when we opened the second time and everyone who admittedly had been hurting went for the quick money grab to try to recoup losses. And guess what? Those people who did that are all complicit in the second closing that came, because you created a situation where the numbers could go through, as opposed to saying, let me be smart here.
Yeah, for sure. Larry Carrino out of Brustman Carrino Public Relations out of here in Miami. Thank you so much, Larry, for stopping in today.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I appreciate it. I hope to see you in the flesh sooner than later.
That's for sure. All right, you guys tuning in over on Spotify, or maybe you're on iTunes, and maybe now on Amazon Music. This show and many of other shows from the network here are now available on all those platforms. Of course, if you're over on YouTube watching this show, make sure and smash the like button. Make sure and hit the bell, because that's how you'll get notifications of more content right here from Foodable Network. We'll continue to track this particular topic, especially here in South Florida, as the restaurant industry starts to reopen across America, and get you guys as much up-to-date information as we can. My name is Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on The Barron Report.